The world did not change with a speech. It changed with silence. In early January, oil tankers left Venezuela and vanished from the map. No signals, no identification. They sailed in dark mode, the maritime equivalent of holding your breath. That is never accidental. When ships go dark, it means markets no longer feel protected by law. It means power has moved from contracts to coercion, from paperwork to force. Soon after, U.S. Marines boarded vessels at sea. A blockade became physical. Sanctions stopped being policy and started becoming action. Then came the moment that explained everything. Not at sea, but on land, in the White House, oil executives were told something extraordinary. You now have total security. If you want to understand the era you're living in, you need to understand this shift. So stay with me, because this story is not really about Venezuela. It is about how power now decides who owns the world's resources. What we are witnessing here is not chaos. It is not improvisation, and it is certainly not accidental. At the center of this story is a single question that every global power eventually faces. What do you do when sanctions stop working? For years, Venezuela existed in a gray zone. Its oil was sanctioned, but still moving. Its government isolated, but still surviving. Its economy crippled, yet not collapsed. That equilibrium is now gone. The United States is no longer merely restricting access to Venezuelan oil. It is physically intervening in how that oil moves, who touches it, and who profits from it. This is a fundamental shift from economic pressure to operational control. And it matters because oil is not just revenue. Oil is leverage. It determines who negotiates, who waits, and who obeys. When tankers are seized, when blockades harden, when executives are promised total security, a new system is taking shape, one where power is enforced, not assumed. To understand where this leads, we have to step back. We have to look at how Venezuela arrived at this moment and why the old rules finally broke. To understand this moment, you have to understand the long arc behind it. Venezuela did not collapse overnight. It slid slowly through a familiar cycle, an economy built almost entirely on oil, a state that spent during booms and borrowed against the future. And when prices fell, institutions weakened instead of adapting. Sanctions accelerated what was already fragile. They cut access to markets, technology, and finance. But they did not stop the oil from flowing. They merely pushed it into the shadows. Tankers learned to reroute. Ownership became opaque. Transponders went dark. This is how sanctioned economies survive not by reform, but by improvisation. For years, this gray system worked just well enough. Oil moved quietly. Money circulated imperfectly. And the regime endured, but shadow systems have limits. They depend on tolerance, on gaps in enforcement, on the assumption that no one will escalate. That assumption has now been shattered. When a global power decides that patience is over, history shows us what happens next. And the first signs always appear at the edges on the seas, in logistics, in enforcement. Which brings us to the first rupture. The rupture came quietly. And then all at once, in the early hours before dawn, U.S. forces moved, not with press conferences, but with boarding teams. A supertanker was intercepted at sea. Another was seized in a coordinated naval operation. These were not warnings. They were demonstrations. For years, sanctioned oil had been treated as a legal puzzle, a question of paperwork, flags, ownership chains. Now it was treated as a security threat. That distinction changes everything, because when enforcement moves from courts to commandos, the message is unmistakable. This system will no longer be tolerated. And notice what followed. Some tankers turned back, others reappeared in Venezuelan waters, suddenly visible again. The shadow market froze, not from law, but from fear. This was not just about stopping ships. It was about collapsing confidence. about making risk unbearable. If you're trying to understand power in the modern world, this is a critical lesson. Markets function on trust, and trust evaporates the moment force becomes unpredictable. This was the first mini crisis, not loud, not dramatic, but decisive, and it revealed something far more important than seized cargo. It revealed the machinery beneath the system. What matters most is not the seizure itself, it is the logic behind it. Beneath the headlines sits a mechanism we rarely talk about openly. Sanctions are supposed to be economic tools, but when they fail, they quietly evolve. First comes restriction, then isolation, and finally, control. What the United States is asserting here is not ownership of oil fields. It is something more subtle: control over movement, over logistics, over who is allowed to touch a barrel, insure it, finance it, transport it. This is how modern power operates. You don't need to invade a country to dominate its economy. You dominate the choke points, shipping lanes, insurance markets, naval presence, legal jurisdiction backed by force. Once those are aligned, sovereignty becomes conditional. Venezuela's oil did not lose value. Its roots did. And when roots are controlled, producers become price takers in their own country. They don't negotiate, they comply. This is the hidden architecture of the global system, invisible when it works, unmistakable when it tightens. And once you see it, the next escalation becomes inevitable. The second crisis did not begin at sea. It began with certainty. Once force is demonstrated, it no longer needs to be repeated. Everyone recalculates. Shipping companies reassess risk. Insurers withdraw coverage. Traders step back. Ports hesitate. Nothing officially collapses, but everything slows. This is how pressure truly works in the modern economy. Not through explosions, but through paralysis. Oil that cannot be insured is oil that cannot move. Oil that cannot move is oil that cannot be sold. And oil that cannot be sold becomes leverage in someone else's hands. What made this moment different was its finality. There was no ambiguity left. The rules were no longer flexible, they were enforced. And enforcement creates a cascade. Shadow networks fragment. Middlemen disappear. Risk concentrates. For Venezuela, this meant a sudden narrowing of options. Not collapse, but confinement. When power tightens the system this way, it doesn't need to announce victory. The silence does that for them. And it sets the stage for the most important question of all. What does this mean for the people who live inside the system? This is where the story stops being abstract and starts becoming personal. Because when systems tighten, they do not tighten evenly. They press downward. If you are an ordinary Venezuelan, you don't experience geopolitics. You experience shortages, delays, uncertainty. Oil revenue is not an abstraction in Venezuela. It pays for food imports, for medicine, for electricity. When oil stops moving freely, daily life slows with it. And if you are listening to me from outside Venezuela, do not look away, because this is how global systems touch individual lives. When tankers are seized, budgets shrink. When routes close, jobs disappear. When leverage shifts, ordinary people absorb the shock first. You may never see a Marine boarding a ship, but you will feel the price of fuel, the cost of food, the weight of instability. This is why these stories matter. Not because of ideology, but because power always has a human bill. If this analysis helps you see the world more clearly, pause for a moment. Share it. Stay engaged, because understanding is the first form of agency, and the consequences do not stop at Venezuela's borders. They never do. What happens in Venezuela does not stay in Venezuela. Oil is a global language. When one producer is disrupted, the system adjusts everywhere else. Tankers reroute, prices recalibrate, alliances quietly shift. The message sent by these seizures was not aimed only at Caracas. It was heard in Tehran, in Moscow, in every capital that relies on energy exports under political pressure, because this was not just enforcement, it was precedent. It showed that access to global markets can be suspended not only by law, but by force. That control over energy flows now sits at the intersection of navies, finance, and diplomacy. For allies, this creates reassurance. For rivals, it creates urgency. For neutral states, it introduces a new calculation. How exposed are we if the system tightens around us? Energy security has always shaped geopolitics, but now it is being enforced in real time, on open water, under global surveillance. And once that line is crossed, it cannot be uncrossed. The world does not return to the old equilibrium. It adapts to the new one, which brings us to the most difficult question of all. Where does this lead next? From here, the future does not move in a straight line. It branches. I see three possible paths. The first is stabilization. Force achieves its goal. Oil flows resume under new terms. Revenue is redirected, tightly monitored, politically conditioned. The system hardens, but life becomes predictable again. Order, not justice, defines success. The second path is stagnation. Control remains, but trust never returns. Investment hesitates, production underperforms. Venezuela exists in a permanent holding pattern, not collapsing, not recovering, a country paused by geopolitics. And the third path is escalation. Precedent spreads, other powers respond in kind. Energy becomes increasingly militarized. Sea lanes turn into pressure points. What began as enforcement evolves into rivalry. None of these outcomes is inevitable, but all of them are plausible, and the difference between them will not be decided by oil alone. It will be decided by restraint, by governance, by whether power remembers its limits. History teaches us this much. Systems built purely on force eventually demand more of it, which is why how this moment ends matters as much as how it began. And that brings me to the final insight. What we have witnessed is not simply a crisis over oil. It is a lesson about power in the 21st century. In a world of fragile institutions and contested norms, control no longer comes from declarations. It comes from leverage, from logistics, from the quiet ability to decide who moves and who does not. Venezuela is the stage, but the script is global. When tankers go dark, when navies enforce markets, when executives are promised total security, we are seeing a system reveal its true operating manual. Order is no longer guaranteed by rules alone. It is enforced. That does not make the world safer by default. It makes it clearer. And clarity is uncomfortable because it forces us to confront a hard truth. Power, when unchecked, rarely stops where it begins. The question is not whether this model will be used again. It will. The question is whether citizens you understand it well enough to demand restraint, accountability, and foresight. If this analysis helped you see the world with sharper eyes, don't let it end here. Stay curious, stay engaged, and follow this conversation forward, because the next chapter is already being written quietly somewhere at sea.